The border is a line that birds cannot see. The border says stop to the wind, but the wind speaks another language and keeps going. The border used to be an actual place, but now it is the act of 1,000 imaginations. The border, the word border, sounds like order, but in this place they do not rhyme. In my mind, this poem speaks powerfully not just to the futility of the border, but also its new ambiguity. The border used to be an actual place, a crossing. Now the border is an investigation into who we are, what we think, what our devices say we think. And the machinery of that surveillance isn't limited to border checkpoints. And obviously, these investigations are old, as we saw from today's panel. But they have first panel about the Chinese exclusion, but obviously they have expanded since then. The machinery of surveillance comes to define and pervade every community it touches, even places up to 100 miles away. I'm thrilled to moderate this panel on how border surveillance has been changing and what it looks like today. We'll begin with Hassan Shibly. And as folks are mic'd, if they want to come and join us on stage, we'll begin with Hassan Shibly of the Council on American Islamic Relations of Florida, who will talk about border searches and interrogations before and after the Muslim ban. He will speak from personal and legal experience. Then we will turn to Professor Patrisia Macias-Rojas of the University of Illinois at Chicago, who conducted an ethnography of life in actual border communities, places where sometimes the ratio of Border Patrol agents to residents is 1 to 17. Think about that for a moment. That is lower than the student-to-teacher ratio in many states. Finally, we will turn to Patrick Eddington of the Cato Institute. As the poet Rio said, the border used to be an actual place. Now, under regulations issued in the 1950s, the Border Patrol can conduct border searches anywhere within 100 miles of the border. And so Patrick will discuss those checkpoints. We will begin with Hassan.
Good morning, everyone. It's a tremendous honor and privilege to speak before all of you today, and I want to thank Alvaro and the Georgetown Law for hosting this critical program, because problems at the border isn't something new for me. I remember last night when I was actually crossing the border from Canada, and they asked me, "Where are you going?" I said, "I'm actually going to Georgetown." Why? Well, I'm going to speak about how you guys treat us at the border. I never had such a smooth experience crossing the border as I did that day. And in fact, he admitted, he said, "Yeah, what's happening to you guys at the border is BS." That was literally his language. He said, "The Muslim ban was unnecessary. It doesn't help keep this country safe. Most of the time we're holding you guys for no real reason. And frankly, it's used for intelligence gathering." And that's the truth. And I can tell you, every single time I visit Canada, I feel welcome. Since I've been a child, every time I visit my country, America, I feel like a suspect, like a criminal. And frankly, I think it's quite a traumatizing experience. The problems with Muslims crossing the border into America, or let me say this, the problem of Americans crossing into America based on their religion did not start with Donald Trump. It's been happening for quite a long time. And what really changed my life was back in 2005, I was in my first year at UB Law School, undergrad at that time, and coming back from a conference late at night, and we're getting to the border slowly, and as we get to the border, my mom, rolls down the window, it's snowing outside, it's cold, it's midnight, and they say, "Where were you?" She said, "We're at an Islamic conference in Toronto." She said, "Ma'am, we'd like you to go in for a random inspection." So my mom, who wears the headscarf and is professor of orthodontics at the University of New York at Buffalo, said, "What do you mean random?" I said, "Mom, random means they saw your headscarf." But I didn't think that would be the actual case. And yet, when I woke up my little sister and my brother, carried them into secondary inspection, I was shocked. I literally felt like I was in my local mosque. There was over 40 members of the American Muslim community. We were held overnight till about 6 a.m., so 6 hours. We were fingerprinted, photographed, frisked, literally put on the wall, legs kicked open. My mom, as she was crying, taking her biometrics. Meanwhile, non-citizens were in and out in 15 minutes. And I told the officers, I said, sir, while you're wasting time with this elderly couple, these babies that are crying, us just because of our religion, real criminals could be getting by. And he said, sir, I'm afraid of the same exact thing. And sure enough, the next day I read in the New York Times that a man who killed an entire family in Canada made it across the border with the bloody weapons in his car. But he wasn't stopped because he looked more like Trump and less like me. That's the truth. Profiling doesn't work. It makes our country less safe, and it makes us less free. Because the conversation within the American Muslim community now is, should we be hiding our identity so we don't get picked on by U.S. Customs? And unfortunately, the data supports the fact that, and it's probably through disparate impact. I don't think there's a sheet that says if you're Muslim, stop them. That would be clearly unconstitutional. But there's a lot of facially neutral criteria which pretty much results in a highly disproportionate number of American Muslims being singled out at the border. What I've actually done is spot check. So I will go into secondary inspection and I will count out how many people are visibly Muslim in the room. I've often documented cases where it's 50 to 75% of the people who are stopped are members of the American Muslim community. At the same time, when I go into a gathering with majority Muslim population, I ask them, how many of you have been stopped by U.S. Customs and held for random inspections? About 50% raise their hand. I say, how many of you filed complaints? About 1%. People are scared because you know what happens when you file complaints? We've documented a number of times where when people file complaints, the next thing that happens is FBI show up at their home or at their office and start interrogating them. And maybe start pushing them to become informants. The Intercept has done excellent work exposing how the data gathered by U.S. Customs is then used by the FBI for intel gathering and then informant recruitment. And they're not just informants, they're actually being pushed into agent provocateur and entrapment operations, which is a whole separate topic that hopefully we can discuss in a future convening. And this continues to hit home. In the month leading up to Trump's inauguration, I actually remember I was going skiing with my brother. And we were supposed to meet at noon, and it's 2 o'clock, he doesn't show up. So I call him, I'm like, Akram, where are you? He said, I was held at the border for the last 2 hours. They demanded my cell phone. They made me turn over my password. They downloaded all the data off of it. I said, Akram, you're under no legal obligation, and this is a point for all of you, you're under no legal obligation to provide your password or unlock your phone. Yes, they may take the phone away, but they can do that even if you unlock it. Now, 3 days later, my brother was again traveling across the border. This time, turn over your cell phone. No. Immediately, within a second, they choked him, slammed him to the ground, forcibly removed the cell phone off of him, using arguably lethal force to search electronics without suspicion, without a warrant. Mind you, that in the Riley case, domestically, the police, even if they arrest you, cannot search your phone without a warrant in most circumstances. So why is it different at the border? And this is where those who are in Congress, those who work for members of Congress, we really need to push for change in the legislation, while at the same time we are working for change through the courts. Now, the interesting thing is that the Buffalo News did a story to see what happened, to tell the story of my brother. And they interviewed one of the border agents, and what one of the border agents said was, well, think about it. If you have a car of 2 teenagers, a car of 2 grandmas, and a car of 2 Muslim men, who do you pull over for secondary inspection? Let me rephrase that. If you have a car of 2 teenagers, 2 grandmas, and 2 Jewish men, who do you pull over? 2 African American men, who do you pull over? Him making that argument proved the point that there is systematic profiling. Right now, federal law does not close the loopholes on religious profiling by federal officials. The loopholes are too big for religious profiling. I think it's disproportionate targeting that's happening, unfortunately, that's leading to a lot of American Muslims, growing up throughout. I remember, and I'll finish sort of with these points, crossing the border as a child, or not as a teenager, taking my grandma to visit her sister. And within a minute, I was in handcuffs. There was no resistance, there was no argument, standard procedure. And my message to people within the administration at the time was, how do you think it feels to grow up as an American Muslim, where every time you're crossing the border, or half the time you're crossing the border, you're held for hours, and you're in handcuffs, you're treated like a criminal. It could make you hate this country. It could reinforce the message of our extremists. Now, thank God it pushed me to build one of the largest civil rights organizations in the state of Florida to counter this, CAIR-Florida. And I'm proud of it. So thank you, Customs, for inspiring me to do that. But the problem isn't going away. We need to challenge it. And just recently, as a final point, we documented that throughout the United States in the month leading up to the Trump administration, because when my brother was pulled over, I sort of did a little Facebook Live video. It got a lot of views, and a lot of people started contacting us about their stories at the border. And we documented how U.S. Customs was singling out Americans, including Muhammad Ali's own son and ex-wife, who we're helping right now and assisting, and asking them the following questions. Are you a devout Muslim? How many times a day do you pray? What mosque do you go to? What school of thought do you follow? What do you think of Donald Trump? What do you think of killing Americans? What do you think of killing civilians? All based on their religion, being asked about their religion. This isn't about targeting Muslims. It's about targeting Americans in violation of the First Amendment, and we really need to close the loopholes that make this possible. Thank you, and God bless you, and I look forward to continuing the conversation.
Can you hear me? Hello, hello, wonderful. Now we'll hear from Professor Patrisia Macias-Rojas.
I don't know if you guys remember your high school. It was very segregated, and you stuck to your own people, and you didn't have that chance to challenge your innate prejudice and how you see the world. So I wonder,
Excellent question. Yeah. I'm sorry to interrupt you. I want to make sure you get an answer. Yeah. So if folks on the panel want to, I think each of you is qualified to answer both of these questions. So do you want to start, Patrick?
So let me jump in and answer your question first with respect to standards. When left to its own devices, right, any agency or department will ultimately set its own standards unless Congress has done something from a statutory standpoint to do it. And your concern is exquisitely well grounded, because this administration has talked about actually lowering the hiring standards for CBP. And we know that in some of these shooting cases that were referred to by my colleague up here, that some of the folks that were involved in that had previously been kicked off of other police forces for exactly the same kind of brutality. So one of the things that's happened to CBP over the last 15 years is that they've really lost any kind of genuine internal affairs functioning mechanism. There was an op-ed that was published, I think, just within the last 2 years about one of the individuals who worked in that shop, and he was bemoaning the fact that the changes there were really going to lead to problems, and he proved to be prophetic. So I think one of the first things that has to happen is you've got to have a reconstitution of that kind of internal affairs capability, CBP. But then you also have to have a Justice Department that's willing to go after agents that engage in violence, unwarranted use of force. And we just have not seen a proclivity on the part of folks to do that. And to get to Jeff's question, I'm going to give you all a message here, and I really hope you take it to heart. I spent 10 years as a lobbyist and 10 years on Capitol Hill. I'm going to tell you that none of these problems are going to get solved in any kind of substantive way unless you get involved in direct political action. And I'm talking about electoral action. That is what it's going to take. You want to get politicians interested in this, you need to make politicians afraid of you and not responding to your concerns. That's the key to all of this. I don't care if it's dealing with FISA surveillance, Rule 41, go down the list, this as well. You've got to be politically involved, and you've got to make your voices heard at the end of the day. Now, I'm at Cato. We don't take pro-con positions on legislation, things of that nature. But what I can say to you, based on my experience in the Hill, is that politicians can be moved most effectively when they know that there are voters who are going to come after them if they do not do the right thing. And that's where you've got to start this entire process at the end of the day. Petitions are wonderful. They can help raise consciousness. But you have got to show politicians that if they allow these things to continue, there are going to be electoral consequences for them. End of soapbox.
You're welcome. This is the soapbox, so it's okay. Hassan.
Yeah, very quickly. At best case, U.S. Customs agents are a reflection of the general population. I say at best case because they're probably not. But the general population study has shown that 50% of Americans support the notion that American Muslims should have to wear special ID cards. Now, what was the last group that had to wear special ID cards? Was the Jews in Germany prior to the Holocaust. You have significant populations, depending on what demographic you're studying, that believe Islam should be illegal, sometimes over 60. About 70% of Trump voters supported the idea of banning Islam in America. Now, again, that's an assault on the Constitution, not on just not just on the Muslim community. So, unfortunately, a lot of the agents have this prejudice. And Gil Kurowski, the last CBP commissioner, admitted it. I mean, there needs to be much education regarding these issues, because it is impacting how they interact, and they have a lot of power. I mean, recently, I forgot to mention this earlier, they're demanding social media passwords of American citizens. Imagine being forced to turn over your social media password, and the reason you're being forced to turn that over is because of your religion. So that's how problematic it is. And to address the other question very quickly, there's a clear discriminatory agenda. Frontline recently did a documentary I highly encourage you to watch, the episode on Bannon's War. He believes America should be at war with Islam, and now he's in the Oval Office, and then he pushed out the Muslim ban to further that. The Muslim ban did not happen, and this kind of targeting of Americans based on religion didn't happen in a vacuum. It's the result of the Islamophobia industry. You can go to Islamophobia.org and read about it, and read about the funding and how it impacts politics. But over $200 million being spent to demonize Americans based on their religion, demonize Islam, and really push for outlawing Islam. In Tennessee, they tried to pass a law saying practicing Islam is treason, punishable by 20 years in jail. And legislators were actually considering that kind of legislation. So it's no wonder that the CBP agent on the ground is picking on Americans based on their religion. And the real direct solution, by the way, besides the political work, is we have to educate the community. I mean, I'm telling the American Muslim community and everybody flat out, don't answer personal religious questions. The answer is, and I did this to an officer, he asked me a question, and my answer was, none of your damn business. Okay, but they need to be put in place when they cross the constitutional boundaries, and we can't empower them to abuse it by giving in and answering their questions and turning over our social media passwords and so on.
We turn to close us out.
Can I add?
Professor.
Oh,
Professor Macias-Rojas.
Well, I don't know if we want to close out with this, but one thing I wanted to point out is that I think we should really pay attention, when we're thinking about training our agents, we should pay more attention to the Border Patrol Union and the ICE Union and the kind of power that they have to shape messages and policies. I've been looking at, in looking at overcrowding in the 80s and 90s, it's interesting how these policies of overcrowding, the intense overcrowding was impacting correctional officers. They were having to subdue people who were protesting unfair conditions. And so both inmates and correctional officers were affected by these policies, right? But correctional officers were able to shape the message that somehow we needed supermax prisons, we needed, more policing, we needed higher wages for them, and lobbying and gaining more power to shape these messages instead of pushing back and saying, you know what, these mandatory minimums are messed up for all of us, inmates and correctional officers who frankly come from many low-income communities, right? And that's certainly the case with the Border Patrol. When I first started doing the research, I could tell the difference between agents who had grown up in border communities and agents who were kind of thrown in there and hired very quickly. And in my last visit, I noticed that the language was changing, that they didn't have that nuance in their language where they were talking about migrants as workers, as families, as people. In some cases, of course there are some that haven't, but they were talking about through the language of crime. They were saying, no, we're not calling them UDAs or undocumented aliens. They're illegal. That's a really different way of thinking and framing. So anyway, but the point I want to get out there is we should pay more attention to the Border Patrol Union and to the ICE Union and learn from what happened in the criminal justice system and the power that the Correctional Officers Union had.
Thank you so much. If you'll join me in thanking our panel. Thank you. Great.